Sometimes the most desperate decisions lead to the most unexpected freedoms. In 1892, when 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell stepped off the dusty train platform in Cedar Creek, Texas, she carried nothing but a worn carpetbag and a marriage certificate to a man she had never met. Behind her lay a father's iron fist and a future that promised nothing but submission. Ahead stood a stranger in weathered boots and a wide-brimmed hat, waiting to claim his mail-order bride. What Sarah didn't know was that this cowboy, Jake Harrison, harbored his own secrets about freedom and the courage it takes to build a life on your own terms. In a time when women were expected to trade one master for another, their unlikely partnership would challenge everything their small Texas town believed about love, independence, and what it truly means to be free. This is the story of how running away from everything you know can sometimes lead you exactly where you belong, and how two souls seeking escape can find something neither expected, a chance to finally breathe. Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cool window of the train car, watching the landscape blur past in shades of brown and gold. Each mile that clicked beneath the wheels carried her further from the only life she had ever known, and closer to a future that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The marriage certificate crinkled in her sweating palm, the ink still fresh enough to smear if she wasn't careful. 2 weeks ago, she had been just another daughter in her father's house in Boston, expected to marry the banker's son who looked at her like she was a prize horse he was considering purchasing. Thomas Mitchell ruled his household with the same iron discipline he used to run his shipping business, and Sarah had learned early that defiance came with consequences that left bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. The decision to answer the advertisement in the newspaper had come during one of her father's rages. He had discovered her reading a book of poetry instead of practicing her embroidery, and the beating that followed left her unable to sit comfortably for days. As she lay on her narrow bed that night, pressing a cold cloth to her swollen cheek, her eyes had fallen on the newspaper she had hidden beneath her mattress. Honest rancher seeks companionate wife for life in Texas. Must be of good character and strong constitution. Marriage by correspondence acceptable. Reply to J. Harrison, Cedar Creek, Texas. The advertisement was simple, almost stark in its honesty. No flowery promises or romantic declarations, just a straightforward request from someone who needed a partner. Sarah had stared at those words until they blurred, imagining what kind of man would place such an advertisement, and what kind of life awaited beyond the suffocating walls of her father's house. Writing the letter had taken her 3 attempts. Each time she tried to present herself as the ideal wife, the words felt false and hollow. Finally, she had written the truth as simply as she could. She was 18 years old, educated, healthy, and seeking a chance at a different life. She could read and write, manage a household, and work hard. She asked for honesty in return and promised the same. Jake Harrison's response had arrived 2 weeks later, and Sarah had nearly dropped the envelope when she recognized the masculine handwriting. His letter was as straightforward as his advertisement had been. He owned a cattle ranch in Texas, worked hard, and lived simply. He was 26 years old, had never been married, and was looking for a partner rather than a decoration. He enclosed money for train passage and asked if she was certain this was what she wanted, because once she came to Texas, there would be no easy way back. That final line had sealed her decision. There was no easy way back from any choice in life, and staying in Boston meant accepting a future that would slowly crush her spirit until nothing remained but an empty shell going through the motions of living. The hardest part had been leaving without saying goodbye to her younger sister, Mary. At 15, Mary still believed their father might soften with age, still hoped for his approval and affection. Sarah had left a letter hidden in their shared room, trying to explain without revealing too much. She couldn't risk their father discovering Mary had known about the plan. The train lurched as it rounded a curve, jolting Sarah from her memories. A woman across the aisle shot her a disapproving look, clearly suspicious of a young woman traveling alone. Sarah had grown accustomed to such looks during the 3-day journey. She wore her plainest dress and kept her wedding ring visible, hoping to deflect questions about her circumstances. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, The conductor called out the next stop. Cedar Creek. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her few belongings. Everything she owned fit into one small carpet bag. 2 dresses, undergarments, a worn Bible her grandmother had given her, the book of poetry that had caused so much trouble, and the letters from Jake Harrison. The train wheezed to a stop with a great hiss of steam, and Sarah forced herself to stand on unsteady legs. Through the window, she could see a small crowd gathered on the wooden platform. Her eyes searched the faces, looking for someone who matched the brief description Jake had provided. Tall, brown hair, usually wearing a brown hat. She saw him immediately. He stood slightly apart from the others, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man accustomed to watching and waiting. The brown hat was there, as promised, worn and shaped by weather and use. Beneath it, she caught glimpses of dark hair and sun-weathered skin. He was watching the train with patient intensity, and when his eyes met hers through the window, she felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with his physical description. Sarah stepped carefully down from the train, her legs shaky after days of sitting. The platform felt strange and solid beneath her feet, and the air was different here, drier, carrying scents of dust and distant cattle and something indefinably open that she had never smelled in Boston's crowded streets. Jake Harrison approached her with unhurried steps, removing his hat as he drew near. His face was younger than she had expected, though lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into bright sunlight. His expression was kind, but cautious, and she realized he was just as uncertain about this meeting as she was. Miss Mitchell. His voice was quiet, with a slight drawl that made her name sound different, softer somehow. Yes. Her own voice came out as barely more than a whisper, and she cleared her throat. Mr. Harrison? He nodded, studying her face with the same careful attention he might give to evaluating livestock, though his expression remained respectful. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. It was fine. Sarah clutched her bag tighter, suddenly, aware of how small and inadequate her possessions must seem. Thank you for the ticket. You're welcome. He gestured toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. If you're ready, we can head to town. The preacher is expecting us. The words hit her like a physical blow. Of course they would marry immediately. That had been the arrangement. But, somehow, in all her planning and preparation, she hadn't quite grasped the reality of it. Within hours, she would be bound to this stranger, dependent on his goodwill for everything from food to shelter to basic kindness. Jake must have seen something in her expression, because his voice gentled. We don't have to rush if you need time to think. There's a boarding house in town where you could stay tonight, if you prefer. The offer surprised her. In her experience, men didn't offer women choices. They simply expected obedience. I don't have money for a room. That's not a concern. Jake settled his hat back on his head, shading his eyes. This is a big decision, Miss Mitchell. I'd rather you be certain. Sarah looked around the small train platform, at the unfamiliar faces, and the vast sky stretching endlessly overhead. Behind her, the train was already preparing to continue its journey, carrying other passengers to other destinations, other dreams or disappointments. She thought of her father's house, of the banker's son with his soft hands and calculating eyes, of a life spent in beautiful rooms that felt like elegantly appointed prisons. I'm certain, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. I came here to marry you, Mr. Harrison. I don't see any reason to delay. Something shifted in Jake's expression, approval, perhaps, or relief. All right then. He picked up her bag without asking, carrying it easily as he led her toward the wagon. The preacher lives just past the main street. His wife is a kind woman. She'll help you with anything you need. The wagon was simple but well-maintained, pulled by 2 horses that stood patiently despite the bustle around them. Jake helped her up onto the seat with old-fashioned courtesy, then climbed up beside her. As they pulled away from the platform, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a shop window, a pale young woman in a plain dress, sitting beside a cowboy she had known for all of 10 minutes, heading toward a marriage that would determine the rest of her life. The main street of Cedar Creek was wider than she had expected, lined with wooden buildings that looked solid and established despite the town's obvious youth. She saw a general store, a saloon, a bank, and several other businesses she couldn't identify. People moved along the wooden sidewalks with purpose, some stopping to stare openly at the wagon and its passengers. Small town, Jake said, following her gaze. People will be curious about you for a while, but they'll settle down once they get used to seeing you around. What have you told them about me? That I was getting married to a woman from back east. Nothing more than that. He glanced at her sideways. What you tell them about yourself is your business. Again, Sarah felt that surprise at being offered a choice. Don't you want to know why I answered your advertisement? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, I figure you had your reasons, just like I had mine for placing it. If you want to tell me sometime, I'd listen. If you don't, that's fine too. The preacher's house was a neat white building with a small garden in front. Jake helped her down from the wagon and retrieved her bag, then knocked firmly on the front door. It opened almost immediately, revealing a round-faced woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. Mr. Harrison, she exclaimed, then turned her attention to Sarah with obvious interest. And this must be your bride. Come in, come in. Reverend Patterson is waiting in the parlor. Sarah found herself swept into a cozy front room where a thin man with gentle eyes stood waiting beside a small table. The ceremony was simple and brief, so brief that it felt almost dreamlike. She heard herself speaking the words that bound her to this stranger, felt his work-rough hand slide a simple gold band onto her finger, listened to the preacher pronounce them husband and wife. When Jake kissed her cheek, a brief, respectful touch, Sarah realized her old life was truly over. There was no going back now, no changing her mind, no escape except the one she had chosen. She was Sarah Harrison now, wife to a man she knew only through letters, committed to a life in a place she had never seen. As they signed the marriage certificate, the preacher's wife pressed a small wrapped package into Sarah's hands. A little something for your new home, she said with a warm smile. Every bride needs something special to mark the beginning. Outside, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of colors that painted the whole sky in brilliant hues. Jake loaded her bag into the wagon again, then helped her up. As they drove away from town, heading into the gathering darkness, Sarah realized she had no idea what lay ahead, not just in the hours to come, but in all the days and years that would follow. The ranch is about an hour from town, Jake said, his voice calm in the darkness. It's not fancy, but it's home, Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see the gesture in the dim light. I'm not expecting fancy. Good. There was something like approval in his voice. Fancy doesn't last long out here anyway. As the wagon rolled through the darkness, carrying her toward her new life, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. For the first time in her life, she was moving towards something she had chosen rather than something that had been chosen for her. Whatever lay ahead, it would be hers to face as an equal partner rather than a helpless dependent. The stars were brighter here than they had ever been in Boston, scattered across the vast sky like diamonds on black velvet. Sarah tilted her head back to look at them, feeling small and infinite at the same time. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay her new home, her new life, and the chance to discover who she might become when she was finally free to choose. The house emerged from the darkness like something from a dream, its windows glowing with warm lamplight against the star-scattered sky. It was larger than Sarah had expected, built of weathered wood that spoke of careful craftsmanship and years of standing strong against the elements. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and she could make out the shapes of chairs and a small table arranged as if for evening conversations. Jake guided the wagon to a stop near the front steps and climbed down, moving with the easy efficiency of a man who had performed these actions countless times before. The horses stamped and snorted softly, eager for their own rest after the journey from town. Sarah sat frozen on the wagon seat, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what lay ahead. This was her home now, this place she had never seen, with a man she had known for mere hours. Sarah? Jake's voice was gentle, and she realized he was standing beside the wagon, offering his hand to help her down. We're home. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had quite prepared for. Home. Sarah placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her down, her legs unsteady after the long ride. The night air was cool and clean, carrying scents she couldn't identify, sage, perhaps, and the lingering warmth of sun-baked earth. "I should tend to the horses," Jake said, retrieving her bag from the wagon bed. "The front door's not locked. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll be in shortly." Sarah watched him lead the horses toward what must be the barn, their shapes disappearing into the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by the house. She stood alone in the yard, clutching her bag and trying to gather the courage to walk up those steps and enter her new life. The front door opened easily, revealing a main room that was both rustic and welcoming. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with books, and a stone fireplace dominated one end of the room. The furniture was simple but well-made, a wooden table and chairs, a comfortable-looking sofa covered with what appeared to be a handmade quilt, shelves lined with books, and various objects she couldn't quite make out in the lamplight. What surprised her most was how clean and organized everything appeared. She had expected bachelor quarters, sparse, utilitarian, perhaps even dirty. Instead, she found a home that someone clearly cared for, where everything had its place, and that place was thoughtfully chosen. Fresh flowers sat in a simple vase on the table, and she could smell something that might have been bread baking. "I hope you're hungry." Sarah spun around to find Jake standing in the doorway, having removed his hat and coat. In the lamplight, she could see his features more clearly, the strong jaw, the intelligent brown eyes, the premature lines that spoke of years spent outdoors. He looked tired but not unfriendly, and she realized he was probably as uncertain about this situation as she was. "A little," she admitted, though truthfully she was too nervous to feel much appetite. "I started a roast this morning before I left for town," he said, moving toward what she now realized was a kitchen area separated from the main room by a low counter. "Figured we'd both be hungry when we got back." Sarah followed him, marveling at the fact that this man had thought to prepare a meal for her arrival. In her father's house, such considerations were the exclusive domain of women. "You cook for yourself?" "Had to learn when my mother died," Jake said matter-of-factly, opening the door of a large cast-iron stove to check on something inside. "Can't afford to hire help, and I got tired of burning everything I tried to make." The matter-of-fact way he mentioned his mother's death made Sarah hesitate before asking, "How long ago was that?" 3 years now. She lived to see me get the ranch established, which was important to her." Jake pulled a large roasting pan from the oven, and the savory aroma of cooked meat and vegetables filled the room. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said I needed someone who wasn't afraid of hard work." "What makes you think I'm not afraid of hard work?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his assessment. Jake set the roasting pan on the counter and turned to look at her directly. "You came here, alone, to marry a stranger and start a new life in a place you'd never seen. That takes courage and a willingness to do what needs doing, regardless of whether it's easy or comfortable." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or pleasure at the compliment, she wasn't sure. "I had good reasons for leaving Boston. I figured as much." Jake began carving the roast with practiced movements. "Like I said before, if you want to tell me about them someday, I'll listen. If not, that's your choice too." As he plated the food, Sarah looked around the kitchen more carefully. It was clearly designed for someone who spent significant time cooking and preparing meals. The shelves were stocked with supplies, pots, and pans hung from hooks on the walls, and everything was arranged for maximum efficiency. This wasn't the kitchen of a man who viewed cooking as an unfortunate necessity. It was the workspace of someone who took pride in feeding himself and others well. "How large is your ranch?" she asked, accepting the plate he offered her. "About 800 acres, Jake replied, settling across from her at the small kitchen table. "Not huge by Texas standards, but enough to run a decent-sized herd if you manage it right." Sarah took a careful bite of the roast and found it perfectly seasoned and tender. "Did you build this house?" "My father started it, and I finished it after he died. He always planned for it to house a family, which is why it's bigger than I need on my own." Jake paused in his eating to look around the room. He wanted his grandchildren to have room to grow up. The implication hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm again. Of course, children were part of this arrangement. That was what marriages were for, especially marriages in places where every person was needed to help build a life from the wilderness. But the thought of bearing children to this stranger she had just married sent a flutter of panic through her chest. Jake seemed to sense her discomfort, because he said, "The house has 3 bedrooms. You can take the one that was my mother's, for now. It has its own washstand and a nice view of the garden." "For now?" Sarah asked quietly. "Until you're ready for something different," Jake said simply. "I'm not going to force anything on you, Sarah. We're married, yes, but that doesn't mean you owe me anything beyond basic partnership. We'll figure out the rest as we go." The relief that washed over Sarah was so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had been prepared to submit to whatever demands her new husband might make. It was, after all, what marriage meant for women in her world. The idea that Jake might actually wait for her consent, that he might see her as a partner rather than property, was almost too wonderful to believe. After dinner, Jake showed her to the room that would be hers. It was larger and more comfortable than the tiny space she had shared with her sister in Boston, with a real window that looked out over what appeared to be a garden plot. The bed was neatly made with what looked like another handmade quilt, and there was a chest of drawers for her belongings. "I hope you'll be comfortable," Jake said from the doorway. "There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold, and the washstand has fresh water." "Thank you." Sarah set her bag on the bed, then turned to face him. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you place that advertisement? I mean, why did you want to marry someone you'd never met instead of finding someone locally?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I guess for some of the same reasons you answered it. The women around here, the ones who might be interested in marrying a rancher, they all have expectations about what that life should look like. Most of them want to live in town, want their husbands to give up ranching for something more civilized and profitable. And you don't want to do that?" "This land is my life," Jake said simply. "My father died to secure it. My mother gave up everything she knew in Kentucky to help build it. And I've put everything I am into making it work. I couldn't give it up any more than I could cut off my own arm." Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So you needed someone who would see it as you do." "I needed someone who would see it as a life worth building, yes. Someone who wouldn't spend every day trying to convince me to sell out and move somewhere with more conveniences." Jake straightened up from the doorframe. "What about you? What were you running from?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could give him some sanitized version of the truth, something that would preserve her dignity and privacy. Or she could trust this man who had already shown her more consideration than she had received from any other man in her life. "My father," she said finally. "He believed that women exist to serve men, and that any sign of independence or spirit needed to be beaten out of us. He had arranged for me to marry a man who shared his views, and I knew that life would slowly destroy whatever was left of who I really am." Jake's expression darkened. "He hit you?" Sarah nodded, unconsciously touching her cheek where the last bruise had finally faded during the train journey. "Regularly. For reading books he thought were inappropriate, for expressing opinions, for asking questions, for any number of things that displeased him." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 12. I think she was grateful for the escape." Jake was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Sarah, I want you to understand something. I will never raise my hand to you in anger. Not ever. I don't care how angry I might get, or how much we might disagree about something. Violence against someone weaker than yourself isn't strength, it's cowardice." The conviction in his voice brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "How can you promise something like that? You barely know me. What if I do something that makes you angry? Then we'll argue about it, or we'll agree to disagree, or we'll find some other way to work it out. But I will never hit you." Jake's expression softened. "My father never laid a hand on my mother in anger, and she was the strongest, most opinionated woman I've ever known. He said that any man who had to use his fists to win an argument with his wife wasn't much of a man at all." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her tears but unable to stop them. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cry." "Nothing to apologize for," Jake said gently. "It's been a long day, and You've got a lot to adjust to. Get some rest, and we'll start fresh in the morning." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "Jake, thank you for the train ticket, for not forcing anything tonight, for giving me a choice about where to sleep. I haven't had choices in a very long time." He paused in the doorway, looking back at her with something like sadness in his eyes. "Everyone deserves choices, Sarah. That's what freedom means, the right to decide your own life." After he left, Sarah unpacked her few belongings and prepared for bed. As she settled under the soft quilt, she listened to the sounds of her new home, the creak of settling wood, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind across open land. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to sleep deeply. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through her window, and she could smell coffee and bacon cooking. She dressed quickly in her plain work dress and made her way to the kitchen, where Jake was standing at the stove. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. "I was beginning to think you might sleep all day." Sarah looked around for a clock and realized she had no idea what time it was. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to oversleep." "You didn't oversleep. It's barely past sunrise. I'm just used to getting up early. The cattle don't care if you're tired." Jake handed her a cup of coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. "Good. Today I thought I'd show you around the ranch, if you're interested. Help you get oriented." Sarah nodded eagerly. "I'd like that. I want to understand what you do here, how everything works." Jake's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Most women find ranch work boring or distasteful." "I'm not most women," Sarah replied, then felt her cheeks warm as she realized how forward that sounded. "No," Jake agreed, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I'm beginning to see that you're not." After breakfast, Jake led her outside into the bright morning sunlight. The ranch looked completely different in daylight than it had in the darkness the night before. She could see rolling hills covered with grass, scattered groves of trees, and, in the distance, the dark shapes of cattle grazing peacefully. The house sat on a slight rise, giving it a commanding view of the surrounding landscape. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "I think so," Jake agreed. "My mother used to say that God must have been showing off when he made Texas." He spent the morning showing her around the immediate area, the barn where the horses were kept, the chicken coop that provided eggs, and the occasional roast chicken, the garden plot where vegetables grew in neat rows. Everything was well maintained and efficiently organized, clearly the result of years of careful work. "The cattle range over most of the property," Jake explained as they walked toward a fenced pasture where several horses grazed. "We round them up twice a year to brand the new calves and take the mature steers to market. The rest of the time, they pretty much take care of themselves." "How many cattle do you have?" "About 300 head right now. I'm hoping to increase that as the ranch becomes more established." Jake leaned against the fence rail, watching the horses. "It's not easy work, but it's honest work. And there's something satisfying about building something that will last, something you can pass on to your children." Again, the mention of children sent a flutter through Sarah's stomach. But this time, instead of panic, she felt something that might have been curiosity. What would it be like to raise children in this place, with this man who seemed to value partnership over domination? "What would you want me to do?" she asked. "I mean, how can I help with the ranch?" Jake turned to look at her with surprise. "You want to help with the actual ranch work?" "I want to be useful. I've never been afraid of hard work, and I'd rather be busy than sitting around with nothing to do." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Besides, if this is going to be my home, shouldn't I understand how to help make it successful?" The smile that spread across Jake's face was the brightest she had seen from him yet. "Sarah Harrison," he said, "I think this partnership might work out better than either of us dared to hope." 3 weeks into her new life, Sarah discovered that freedom had its own challenges. Each morning brought decisions she had never been allowed to make. What to wear, how to spend her time, what tasks to tackle first. After 18 years of having every moment dictated by her father's demands, the weight of choosing her own path felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. She had fallen into a routine with Jake that surprised her with its natural ease. He rose before dawn to tend the animals and check on the cattle while she prepared breakfast and planned the day's household tasks. They ate together most mornings, sharing plans and discussing the work ahead. It was a partnership unlike anything she had witnessed in her parents' marriage, where her mother had been expected to anticipate her father's needs without question or conversation. On this particular morning, Jake lingered over his coffee longer than usual, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah, I've been thinking about something." She looked up from the eggs she was scrambling, noting the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" "Winter's coming faster than I expected this year. I need to get the cattle moved to the lower pastures soon. And there's a section of fence that needs repair before the weather turns." Jake paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "It's going to mean several days of hard work, and I could use help. Real help, not just packing lunches and waving goodbye from the porch." Sarah set down her spatula and turned to face him fully. "What kind of help?" "Riding, herding cattle, camping out under the stars for 3 or 4 nights while we get them moved and the fence repaired." Jake met her eyes steadily. "It's not easy work, and it's not what most people would consider appropriate for a lady. But if you're serious about wanting to be a full partner in this ranch, this is what that looks like." A thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness shot through Sarah's chest. She had been riding the gentle mare Jake had designated as hers, but only for short trips around the immediate area. The idea of actually working cattle, of proving herself capable of real ranch work, appealed to something deep in her spirit that had never been allowed expression. "Do you think I can do it?" she asked honestly. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to," Jake replied without hesitation. "The question is whether you want to. It'll be uncomfortable, dirty, and exhausting. You'll probably get thrown from your horse at least once, and you'll definitely discover muscles you didn't know you had." Sarah thought about the alternative, staying safely at the house while Jake rode out alone to handle the dangerous work of moving 300 head of cattle across rough terrain. She thought about her father, who had never trusted her to make a decision more complex than what color thread to use in her embroidery. "When do we start?" she said firmly. Jake's face broke into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "Tomorrow morning, before sunrise. We'll need to get an early start if we're going to reach the holding area by midday." The rest of that day was spent in preparation. Jake showed her how to pack light, but efficiently for several days on the trail, how to tie a bedroll that would stay secure during long rides, and how to load saddlebags for maximum balance and accessibility. He checked her riding boots and declared them adequate, though he insisted she borrow a pair of his old leather chaps to protect her legs from thorns and branches. That evening, as Sarah tried on the borrowed clothing and practiced the quick, efficient movements Jake had demonstrated for mounting and dismounting in difficult terrain, she caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had stepped off the train in Cedar Creek. Her skin had bronzed from days spent outdoors, her hands had developed calluses from unfamiliar work, and there was something in her expression that spoke of confidence and purpose. She was still examining her reflection when she heard Jake's voice from the main room. But he wasn't alone. Another man's voice, deeper and rougher, was answering him. Sarah quickly changed back into her regular clothes and ventured out to find Jake speaking with a stranger who looked like he hadn't seen soap or water in several weeks. "Sarah, this is Tom Brennan," Jake said, rising from his chair as she entered. "Tom, my wife, Sarah." Tom Brennan was a small, wiry man with intelligent eyes and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. He touched his hat respectfully but remained seated, studying Sarah with unconcealed curiosity. "Heard Jake got himself a mail-order bride from back east," Tom said bluntly. "Figured she'd be gone back where she came from by now. Most city women don't last long out here." Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, ready to defend her if necessary, but she decided to speak for herself. "I'm not most city women, Mr. Brennan, and I didn't come here planning to leave." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's so? Jake tells me you're planning to help with the cattle drive tomorrow. You ever worked cattle before?"